October 14th, 1893, Miller's Crossing, Alabama. Abigail Hargrove, 19 years old, daughter of one of the most respected farmers in the county, was found dead in her bed at dawn. Her body was cold, her skin unnaturally pale, almost translucent. But what disturbed Dr. Ambrose Thatcher most was not the rigor mortis or the expression frozen on her face. It was the complete absence of blood in her veins. When he made the first incision during the preliminary examination, nothing flowed. The body was empty, drained. And on her neck, barely visible beneath the collar of her nightgown, were two small puncture marks, perfectly aligned, as if something sharp had pierced the skin with surgical precision. 3 weeks later, Ruth Ashford, 16, would be found in identical circumstances. Then another and another. By the time winter arrived, Miller's Crossing had buried 7 bodies, all exsanguinated, all bearing the same marks. And every single witness who saw the victims in their final night spoke of the same thing: a pale figure standing at the edge of the property, watching, silent, motionless, phantom-like. Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing and unresolved mysteries of the American South. Before we begin, I want to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it right now? Leave a comment below. It helps us understand our community, and honestly, knowing that people across the world are listening to these stories in the dead of night makes them feel even more real. So go ahead, tell us where you are. Now let's go back to 1893, back to Miller's Crossing, a small agricultural settlement in rural Alabama, barely a dot on any map, where fewer than 300 souls lived and worked. A place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were hard to keep, where the arrival of a stranger was an event discussed for weeks. This was not a town that should have had a mystery, but it did. And what happened there over the course of 4 months would shake the foundations of rational thought, divide the community into believers and skeptics, and leave behind questions that remain unanswered to this day. The first death was attributed to illness. The second raised concerns. By the third, panic had set in. The town's physician, Dr. Ambrose Thatcher, a man trained in Philadelphia and known for his methodical approach, could find no medical explanation for the condition of the bodies. Sheriff Dalton Merrick, a pragmatic man, with little tolerance for superstition, was forced to confront the impossible. Something in Miller's Crossing was killing people, and it was doing so in a way that defied every natural law he understood. The townspeople had their own explanation. They called it the phantom vampire, a creature neither fully alive nor entirely dead, something that walked the line between the physical and the spectral, preying on the living under the cover of darkness. The name spread quickly, whispered in hitchens, murmured in church pews, shouted in town meetings. Some said it was divine punishment. Others believed it was a curse brought by Ezra Holloway, the recluse who lived in the decaying Brennan estate at the edge of town, a man no one had spoken to in years, a man whose very existence seemed wrong. But here's the thing about monsters. Sometimes they're not what you expect. Sometimes the truth is worse than the legend. And sometimes the monster is something far more human than anyone wants to believe. What really happened in Miller's Crossing? Was there truly a supernatural predator stalking the night? Or was something far darker taking place, hidden beneath the veneer of rural American life, masked by fear and superstition? The answer, if there even is one, lies buried in forgotten archives, decaying journals, and testimonies that were never meant to be made public. This is the story of the phantom vampire of Miller's Crossing, and I need to warn you, what you're about to hear is not comfortable, it's not neat, and it doesn't end the way you want it to. To understand what happened in Miller's Crossing, you need to understand the world it existed in. 1893 was a year of transformation in America, but not everywhere felt that change equally. While cities like New York and Chicago were embracing electric lights and industrial progress, rural Alabama remained trapped in a different era. The Civil War had ended nearly 30 years prior, but the South was still bleeding from its wounds. Reconstruction had failed. The promise of rebuilding had collapsed into sharecropping, poverty, and racial violence. Communities like Miller's Crossing were isolated, economically devastated, and deeply conservative in their worldview. Miller's Crossing itself was little more than a cluster of farms surrounding a single dirt road that intersected with the old trading route between Montgomery and the smaller settlements to the west. Hence the name Miller's Crossing. There had once been a mill there, built in 1847 by a man named Josiah Miller, but it had burned down during the war and was never rebuilt. By 1893, the town had a general store, a Methodist church, a one-room schoolhouse, and not much else. The population was approximately 280 people, almost all of whom were white farmers or laborers. A small number of black families lived on the outskirts, working as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, largely invisible in official records. Life in Miller's Crossing was dictated by the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant tending, autumn meant harvest, winter meant survival. There was little room for leisure, little tolerance for deviation from routine. The church, led by Reverend Josiah Pendleton, was the center of social and moral authority. Pendleton was a fire and brimstone preacher, a man who saw sin everywhere and salvation as something earned through suffering. His sermons frequently invoked images of damnation, of bodies rising from graves, of the devil walking among men in disguise. In retrospect, his rhetoric would take on a disturbing new meaning. The Hargrove family was among the town's most established. Cornelius Hargrove owned 80 acres of farmland, a significant holding for the area, and employed several workers during harvest season. He was known as a fair man, stern but not cruel, a deacon in the church and a figure of quiet authority. His wife, Margaret, was described in local correspondence as pious and devoted, a woman who managed the household with efficiency and grace. Their children, Emmett and Abigail, were both unmarried and living at home, which was not unusual for the time. Emmett, at 23, was being groomed to take over the farm. Abigail, at 19, was expected to marry within a year or two, though no engagement had been announced. Abigail was, by all accounts, unremarkable. She helped with household duties, attended church every Sunday, and had a small circle of friends. Among the other young women in town, there was nothing in her life that suggested she would become the center of a nightmare. But in early October 1893, she began to complain of fatigue. She grew pale. She lost her appetite. Her mother initially attributed it to feminine troubles, a common and unspoken ailment. Dr. Thatcher was not called until Abigail could no longer leave her bed. Thatcher's notes from that first visit, preserved in the archives of the Lee County Historical Society, are clinical and detached. Patient presents with extreme pallor, weakness and low body temperature. Pulse is weak and irregular. No fever, no signs of infection, no obvious external injury. He prescribed rest and a tonic, standard treatment for anemia. But Abigail did not improve. She deteriorated, and on the night of October 13th, she whispered something to her mother that would later be repeated in testimony. "He's standing outside my window. The pale man. He's watching me." Margaret Hargrove dismissed it as delirium, but the next morning, Abigail was dead. The funeral was held 3 days later. The entire town attended. Reverend Pendleton delivered a sermon about the fragility of life and the certainty of judgment. Abigail was buried in the small cemetery behind the church, in a plot beside her grandparents. The Hargroves grieved, as families do. The town mourned, as communities do. And then, 3 weeks later, Ruth Ashford died in exactly the same way. Ruth was the daughter of a tenant farmer, a girl with little education and fewer prospects. She had been working as a housemaid for the widow Beatrice Collier, an elderly woman who lived alone in a farmhouse a mile outside town. Ruth's symptoms mirrored Abigail's: sudden weakness, extreme pallor, the slow draining of vitality. Dr. Thatcher was called again, and this time he performed a more thorough examination. What he found would change everything. The body was empty of blood, not low, not anemic. Empty, as if something had systematically extracted every drop, and on Ruth's neck, hidden beneath her hair, were the same 2 marks. Thatcher documented his findings and presented them to Sheriff Merrick. The 2 men sat in the back room of the general store, going over the notes by lamplight, and came to an uncomfortable conclusion. They were dealing with something neither of them understood. Merrick, ever the pragmatist, wanted to believe there was a rational explanation. Poison, perhaps, or some exotic disease, but Thatcher had seen diseases. This was not that. The town, however, had already made up its mind. This was not illness. This was not coincidence. This was a vampire, and they knew exactly where to look. The Brennan estate sat on the eastern edge of Miller's Crossing, a decaying monument to a family that no longer existed. Built in the 1850s by Clayton Brennan, a cotton merchant who had made a fortune before the war, the house was a 2-story structure with a wraparound porch, tall, windows, and a widow's walk that served no practical purpose. After Clayton's death in 1869, the property passed through several hands, none of whom stayed long. By 1890, it had been abandoned entirely, the land overgrown, the house itself slowly surrendering to rot and weather. And then Ezra Holloway arrived. No one knew where he came from. He simply appeared one day in the autumn of 1890, a gaunt man in his 40s with hollow eyes and a face that seemed carved from wax. He purchased the Brennan estate through a lawyer in Montgomery, paying in cash, and moved in without introducing himself to anyone. He did not attend church. He did not visit the general store. He did not speak to his neighbors. On the rare occasions when someone saw him, usually at dusk or dawn, he was always alone, walking the perimeter of his property or standing motionless on the porch, staring at nothing. The town quickly decided that Ezra Holloway was strange, and in a place like Miller's Crossing, strange was dangerous. Rumors began almost immediately. Some said he was a doctor who had lost his license after a scandal. Others claimed he was a veteran who had gone mad during the war. A few whispered that he was a spiritualist, a practitioner of dark arts, someone who communed with the dead. Widow Collier, who claimed to know about such things, said she had seen lights in the windows of the Brennan estate late at night, moving in patterns that suggested rituals. Reverend Pendleton preached a sermon in which he did not name Holloway directly, but spoke at length about the dangers of welcoming strangers who refused God's fellowship. But Holloway remained invisible, a ghost living among the living, and eventually the town's attention moved on, until Abigail died, and then Ruth, and then the stories started. Martha Kinsley, a farmer's wife, swore she had seen a figure standing in her yard 3 nights before Ruth's death. She described it as impossibly tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the moonlight. When she called out, it did not move, it simply stared, and then, when she blinked, it was gone. James Holcomb, who worked as a labourer on the Hargrove farm, reported seeing a man walking along the road near the estate late one evening. He said the man moved strangely, gliding rather than walking, and when Holcomb tried to approach, the figure vanished into the trees. Children began refusing to go outside after dark. Families started locking their doors, something that had never been necessary before, and slowly, methodically, the town began to convince itself that Ezra Holloway was not a man at all. He was something else, something unnatural, something that fed on blood. Dr. Thatcher tried to maintain reason. He published a notice in the county newspaper explaining that exsanguination could be caused by rare medical conditions, that panic was more dangerous than any illness, that superstition had no place in modern society. But his words fell on deaf ears. Reverend Pendleton countered with his own sermon, citing biblical passages about creatures of the night, about Cain being cursed to wander the earth, about the wages of sin being death. The breaking point came on November 9th, when Eliza Pruitt, 14 years old, was found unconscious in a field half a mile from her home. She was pale, weak, and barely breathing. On her neck were the marks. Dr. Thatcher managed to save her life with a transfusion from her father, a risky and experimental procedure at the time, but Eliza never fully recovered. She remained bedridden, unable to speak coherently, whispering about the pale man who had visited her in the night, who had touched her throat with cold fingers, who had drunk from her like water from a well. That was when Sheriff Merrick made his decision. He could no longer ignore the evidence, no matter how impossible it seemed. He gathered a group of men, 8 in total, and announced that they would investigate the Brennan estate. If Ezra Holloway was innocent, he would have nothing to hide. If he was guilty, they would find the proof. The investigation was scheduled for November 12th, but 2 nights before, on November 10th, something happened that would escalate the situation beyond control. Thomas and Clara Voss, a couple in their 30s who lived on a small plot near the church, woke to the sound of their dog barking frantically. Thomas grabbed his rifle and went outside. In the moonlight, standing at the edge of his property, was a figure. It was tall, pale, and motionless. Thomas shouted at it to identify itself. The figure did not respond. Thomas fired a warning shot into the air. The figure took a single step forward, and then Thomas saw its face. Or rather, he saw that it had no face, not in the way that mattered. The features were there, but they were wrong, distorted, as if someone had sculpted a human visage from memory and gotten the proportions slightly off. The eyes were too large, the mouth too wide, the skin too smooth. Thomas fired directly at it. He later swore he hit it square in the chest. The figure staggered backward but did not fall. And then, impossibly, it turned and ran, not with the gait of a human, but with a loping, unnatural stride that covered ground far too quickly. Within seconds, it had vanished into the darkness. By morning, the entire town knew, and by noon, a mob had formed. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Do you believe in the supernatural explanation, or do you think there's something more human at work here? Let us know your theories. The men gathered at the church, armed with rifles, torches, and an absolute certainty that they were doing God's work. Sheriff Merrick tried to maintain order, insisting that they follow proper procedure, but the crowd would not be restrained. Reverend Pendleton blessed them and quoted scripture about casting out demons. And at 2 in the afternoon, they marched toward the Brennan estate. What they found there would redefine everything they thought they knew about evil. The mob reached the Brennan estate just before dusk. The house stood silent against the darkening sky, its windows black and empty, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The front door was closed but not locked. Sheriff Merrick, standing at the head of the group, knocked 3 times and announced their presence. There was no response. He pushed the door open. The interior was exactly what one would expect from an abandoned house inhabited by a recluse. Dust covered every surface. The furniture was sparse and mismatched. The walls were stained with water damage. But what struck the men immediately was the smell. Not the musty odor of decay, but something sharper, more chemical, like vinegar mixed with copper. It hung in the air, thick and oppressive. They moved through the ground floor cautiously, checking each room. The parlor was empty. The kitchen contained a Single plate, a single cup, and a drawer full of surgical instruments. The dining room had been converted into something resembling a laboratory, with beakers, jars, and notebooks stacked on a table. Sheriff Merrick ordered 2 men to bag the notebooks as evidence, but Ezra Holloway was nowhere to be found. Then someone noticed the door. It was in the corner of the kitchen, half hidden behind a shelf. A cellar door, and it was padlocked from the outside. They broke the lock with an axe. The door swung open, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. The smell from below was overwhelming, a mixture of rot, chemicals, and something unidentifiable. Sheriff Merrick lit a lantern and began the descent. 6 men followed. The rest stayed above, guarding the exits. The cellar was larger than expected, stretching beneath the entire footprint of the house. The ceiling was low, forcing the men to stoop. The walls were stone, damp and cold, and arranged along the length of the room were tables, 4 of them, each one stained dark with substances that did not require identification. On the first table were glass jars. Inside each jar, preserved in clear liquid, were organs, hearts, lungs, livers, all labeled with dates and initials. The most recent was dated November 8th, 2 days prior. The initials were E.P. Eliza Pruitt. On the second table were notebooks, dozens of them, filled with handwritten notes in cramped, frantic script, diagrams of the human circulatory system, chemical formulas, observations about blood preservation, and sketches, dozens of sketches of human bodies in various states of dissection. On the third table were medical instruments, scalpels, saws, needles, tubes, and a device that none of the men recognized, a glass cylinder connected to rubber tubing designed to extract fluids through suction. On the fourth table was a body. It was male, middle-aged, dressed in the remnants of what had once been fine clothing. The skin was grey and waxy, the eyes sunken, the mouth open in a silent scream. The chest had been opened and crudely stitched back together. The neck bore the same 2 puncture marks found on every victim. Sheriff Merrick bent closer, examining the face. And then he realized why it looked familiar. It was Ezra Holloway. Ezra Holloway was dead, and he had been dead for a long time. The revelation hit like a physical blow. If Holloway was dead, then who or what had been living in the house? Who had been conducting these experiments, and who or what had been seen by dozens of witnesses stalking the night? One of the men, a farmer named Jacob Reed, noticed something strange about Holloway's body. The stitching on the chest was uneven, as if done by someone with limited skill, and the skin around the incisions was discolored, not with decay, but with something that looked like chemical burns. Reed reached out and touched the skin. It was cold, but not with the cold of death. It was the cold of preservation. Sheriff Merrick ordered everyone out of the cellar. They needed to think. They needed to process what they had found. But as they turned to leave, one of the men screamed. Something was moving in the corner. It had been hidden in the shadows, pressed against the wall, perfectly still. But now it was emerging. It was humanoid in shape, but wrong in every detail. The proportions were distorted, the joints bent at unnatural angles. The skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones. That seemed too long. And the face, dear God, the face. It wore Ezra Holloway's face, but it was a mask, poorly fitted, slipping at the edges to reveal something beneath that was not human. It lunged. The men fired. Shots echoed in the confined space, deafening and chaotic. The creature staggered but did not fall. It moved with horrifying speed, knocking 2 men to the ground before darting up the stairs. By the time the group reached the ground floor, it had vanished. They searched the house. They searched the grounds. They searched until dawn. But whatever it was gone. In the days that followed, Sheriff Merrick and Dr. Thatcher analyzed the materials found in the cellar. The journals, once deciphered, told a story more disturbing than any legend. Ezra Holloway had not been a doctor, but he had been educated. His notes indicated a background in medical study, though he had never completed formal training. He had become obsessed with the idea of preserving life, of conquering death through scientific means. His writings referenced European texts on blood transfusion, experiments in reanimation, and alchemical theories about the essence of vitality. At some point, Holloway's experiments had crossed a line. He began testing his theories on animals, draining their blood and attempting to restore them using chemical solutions. The results were uniformly fatal, but Holloway was undeterred. He believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough. The final entries in his journal, dated July 1893, described his ultimate experiment. He had perfected a solution that could preserve tissue indefinitely. He had developed a method of extracting and storing blood without coagulation, and he had come to a conclusion that would seal his fate. The only way to truly test his theories was on himself. Ezra Holloway had drained his own blood, replaced it with his preservation solution, and attempted to become the first immortal man. He had failed, but something had succeeded. The creature the men encountered in the cellar was not Ezra Holloway. It was what his experiment had created, a thing animated not by life, but by the chemical processes he had devised, driven by an instinct to feed, to consume, to sustain itself. It had worn his face, worn his clothes, and when it needed more blood to continue its existence, it had gone out into the night to hunt. But here's where the story fractures into questions that have no answers. If the creature was the result of Holloway's failed experiment, how did it continue to function for months? How did it know to target specific victims? How did it evade capture even after being shot multiple times? And most disturbingly, how did it manage to perform surgical procedures on new victims, extracting their blood with the same precision Holloway's notes described? Was it operating on instinct? Or had Holloway's consciousness somehow survived within the thing he had created? We'll never know, because the creature was never found. The official story of Miller's Crossing ends in November 1893. The authorities sealed the Brennan estate. Ezra Holloway's body was cremated against the protests of Reverend Pendleton, who believed it should be buried in unconsecrated ground with a stake through the heart. The journals and equipment were confiscated and sent to Montgomery, where they were reviewed by medical examiners and promptly classified as the ravings of a madman. No further deaths occurred. The sightings stopped. By Christmas, the town had begun to return to normalcy. But normalcy is a fragile thing, and Miller's Crossing never fully recovered. Over the following decades, fragments of the story would resurface, each one adding new layers of uncertainty to what had already happened. In 1921, a historian named Clifford Barnes was researching post-Reconstruction Alabama for a book on rural Southern communities. He visited Miller's Crossing, now a nearly abandoned settlement with fewer than 50 residents, and interviewed several elderly locals who remembered the events of 1893. One of them, a woman who had been 12 years old at the time, told him something that had never been recorded in official accounts. She said that after the raid on the Brennan estate, after the creature had escaped, her father, one of the men in Sheriff Merrick's group, had become obsessed with finding it. He organized nightly patrols, convinced that the thing was still hiding somewhere nearby. One night in December 1893, he returned home in a state of shock. He told his daughter that he had found a cave in the woods 3 miles north of town. Inside the cave were bodies, not fresh corpses but partially preserved remains, arranged in a circle around a crude altar made of stones. He counted 9 bodies in total, all bearing the same neck wounds. But when he brought Sheriff Merrick and Dr. Thatcher to the location the next day, the cave was empty. The bodies were gone, and the altar had been destroyed. The woman's father never spoke of it again. He became withdrawn, haunted, and died in 1902 of what the death certificate listed as heart failure. She believed he had seen something else in that cave, something he could not bring himself to describe. Clifford Barnes included this testimony in his notes, but it was never published. His manuscript was rejected by multiple publishers who found the story too sensational and the evidence too thin. The manuscript itself was lost in a fire in 1958. In 1967, during the construction of a highway that would eventually bypass what remained of Miller's Crossing, workers uncovered a sealed cellar beneath what had once been the Brennan estate. The house itself had been demolished in the 1940s, but the foundation remained. Inside the cellar, they found jars, hundreds of them, all filled with preserved organs and blood, all labeled with initials and dates. Some of the dates were from 1893, but others were more recent. The latest was dated 1952. The discovery made local news briefly, then vanished from the record. The jars were destroyed, the cellar was filled with concrete, and no further investigation was conducted. Dr. Lawrence Kemp, a forensic pathologist who examined photographs of the jars before they were destroyed, wrote a letter to the Alabama Historical Association in 1971. In it, he stated that the preservation techniques used were not consistent with methods available in the 1890s. They were, in fact, closer to techniques developed in the 1930s and 1940s. He requested access to the site for further study. His request was denied. In 1984, a journalist named Patricia Hollis attempted to write an article about the phantom vampire for a regional magazine. She interviewed descendants of the families involved, reviewed court records, and visited the site where Miller's Crossing had once stood. What she found was a conspiracy of silence. No one wanted to talk. The few who did speak asked not to be named and provided conflicting accounts. One elderly man, claiming to be the grandson of Sheriff Dalton Merrick, told her that his grandfather had kept a private journal separate from his official reports. In that journal, Merrick had written that the creature they found in the cellar was not the only one. He believed there were others, created by Holloway in earlier experiments, that had escaped or been released before the raid. Merrick spent the rest of his life searching for them, but found nothing. He died in 1911, and his journal was buried with him at his request. Patricia Hollis submitted her article. It was rejected for legal reasons. She attempted to self-publish it as a pamphlet. The printing was shut down by a cease and desist order from a law firm representing concerned descendants. She never wrote about Miller's Crossing again. The most recent fragment comes from 2003. A woman named Jennifer Ashford, claiming to be a descendant of Ruth Ashford, contacted a paranormal research group based in Birmingham. She said that her grandmother had told her stories about Ruth's death, stories that differed from the official version. According to her grandmother, Ruth had not been killed by the creature. She had been sacrificed. The town, desperate and terrified, had chosen her as an offering, believing that if they gave the creature what it wanted, it would leave them alone. Ruth had been drained of blood by volunteers, acting under the guidance of Reverend Pendleton, and the creature had been blamed to cover up the murder. Jennifer provided no evidence. The paranormal group dismissed her claims as fabrication. But before the conversation ended, Jennifer said something that stuck with one of the investigators. She said, "My grandmother told me that Ruth wasn't the only one. There were others. The town made deals, and the deals continued for a long time." When pressed for details, Jennifer refused to elaborate. She said her family had been threatened for generations to stay silent, and she had already said too much. She hung up and never made contact again. These fragments, testimonies, rumors, suppressed documents, whispers passed down through generations paint a picture far more complex than the simple narrative of a mad scientist and his monstrous creation. They suggest layers of complicity, of ritual, of something darker woven into the fabric of Miller's Crossing itself. But the truth remains elusive, scattered, contradictory, and perhaps that's exactly how someone wanted it. So what happened in Miller's Crossing in 1893? What was the phantom vampire? And more importantly, where did it go? There are three prevailing theories, none of which can be proven, all of which have their adherents. The first theory is the scientific explanation. Ezra Holloway was a disturbed individual who conducted illegal experiments on himself and others. The creature found in the cellar was the result of his final experiment, a reanimated corpse driven by residual, unchemical processes. It was not supernatural, but rather a grotesque example of pseudoscience taken to its extreme. After the raid, the creature either died from its injuries or fled into the wilderness, where it eventually succumbed to decay. The subsequent sightings and discoveries were either hoaxes, misidentifications, or unrelated events that became attached to the legend over time. This theory is favored by skeptics and academics. The second theory is the supernatural explanation. Miller's Crossing was haunted, not by a creature of Holloway's making, but by something far older, something that existed in that place long before the town was built. Holloway did not create the vampire, he summoned it. His experiments were not scientific, but ritualistic, and the thing that emerged was a genuine entity from folklore, sustained by blood and darkness. It never left Miller's Crossing. It simply retreated into hiding, surfacing occasionally when it needed to feed, protected by the silence of those who knew the truth. This theory is favored by believers in the paranormal and those who grew up hearing the stories. The third theory is the most disturbing. There was no creature. There was only the town. The deaths were real, but they were not caused by a monster. They were caused by people. Reverend Pendleton, Sheriff Merrick, Dr. Thatcher, they were part of a conspiracy, a cult operating beneath the surface of respectable society. The story of the phantom vampire was a cover, a way to explain away ritualistic murders performed for reasons we can only speculate about. Blood sacrifice, medical experimentation, control through fear. When the charade threatened to unravel, they staged the raid, planted evidence, and blamed a convenient scapegoat. Ezra Holloway may have been a victim himself, murdered and mutilated to sell the lie. And the creature in the cellar? A fabrication. A man in costume, or perhaps one of the cult members, mutilated beyond recognition, acting out the role assigned to him. This theory is favored by those who distrust authority and believe in hidden histories. Which theory is correct? I can't tell you. No one can. The evidence is contradictory. The witnesses are dead. The records have been suppressed or destroyed. All we have are fragments, shadows, and the certainty that something terrible happened in Miller's Crossing, something that echoes to this day. What I can tell you is this: there are places in this world where the past does not stay, buried, where the line between truth and legend blurs, where asking questions is dangerous and finding answers is worse. Miller's Crossing is one of those places. To this day, the site where the town once stood remains undeveloped. The few buildings that survived into the 21st century have been abandoned. The roads leading there are unmarked, and the people who live in the surrounding area do not talk about it. But sometimes, late at night, travelers on the back roads of rural Alabama report seeing something strange. A figure standing at the edge of a field, tall and pale, motionless, watching, and when they slow down to get a better look, it's gone. Is it memory? Is it imagination? Or is it something that never really left? I don't have the answer, but I want to know what you think. Leave a comment below with your theory. Which explanation makes the most sense to you? Do you believe in the creature? Do you think it was a cover-up? Or do you think there's something else going on? Something we haven't considered? And if you made it this far, thank you. These stories matter because you listen to them, because you engage with them, because you refuse to let them be forgotten. So subscribe if you haven't already, hit that notification bell, and join our haunted community. We have more stories like this, more mysteries that refuse to stay buried, and I promise you, each one is darker than the last. Until next time, remember, some doors are locked for a reason. Some histories are hidden because they're too dangerous to remember. And some monsters don't need to be real to destroy lives. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe.